Hey, what's happening, family? Welcome to Every Nation Bryanston YouTube channel. My name is Siviwe and I'm glad that you are here. We are all about two things: knowing God and making Him known. And if that's the first time you've heard that phrase, or maybe it is the first time you are here online watching this video, not only do I want to say welcome to you, but I would love for you to do us a favor. Under this video, there is a link to a connection card that can allow you just to let us know that you are here, or even for you to reach out to us so that we might find ways to connect with you and connect you to our spiritual family here at Every Nation Bryanston. Do me a favor, click on the link below. Let us know who you are, where you're from, how we can serve you. Or maybe you just want to do it because right at the bottom of that link, there are 3 charities doing great work in the city of Joburg. And what we do here is that whenever somebody comes for the first time here to our YouTube channel and clicks that link, fills those details, you get to choose a charity of your choice and we will donate 100 Rand to that charity. So please do click on that connection card. Looking forward to hearing from you. We are nearing the end of our ACT series. In fact, this is the second last week. We'll be finalizing next week with our ACT series. But I've got some news for you that I think will be great. We are planning on May 21st. So today it's going to be week 11 of our ACT series. Next week, week 12. And then the week after will be May the 21st. Now, here's what we want to do on that Sunday. We are going to pause our services. We're just going to meet at 10 a.m. on the field out next to our Every Nation Bryanston Sunday venue. Now, from 10 up until like 12 or 12:30, we're going to be having a fun day, fellowship day, food, breaking of bread. You know, what we've been doing throughout this series is taking communion together every single week. Now, what we're going to do as kind of a celebration and a reflection moment of this series is that on May the 21st, we're going to have one service out in the field from 10 o'clock. This is going to be filled with fun. There'll be activities and games for the kids. Also, we're going to have a trivia that we put people out into teams. That whole trivia is going to be us asking questions through the book of Acts, and we're going to have winners and trophies and awards for people as well. This is going to give us an opportunity to not only break bread together and take communion physically together, but also allow us as a time for the community to commune together, to reflect together, to have fun together, to connect together as we move forward throughout this year. So diarize it. May 21st, we will be meeting physically 10 a.m. out on the Bryandale primary field, and it's going to be time for fun, food, fellowship, and some awards for anyone who actually has really been reading throughout this book of Acts. All our trivia questions will be from the book of Acts. Looking forward to seeing you. So what it means for you here online is that we will make available a video, whether it be one of our preachers here from Bryanston or a preacher from our Every Nation family that we believe will serve you that week. That's what we'll be putting on here online for that Sunday. But I do hope that we can see you physically on May 21st, 10 a.m. Not next week, but the week after, May 21. Diarize that. Now, as I said, we are continuing with our ACT series, Dare to Follow. And today we are going to be in Acts chapter 27. So get your Bibles out, your notepads out, and let's get to work. A couple of weeks ago, one of the couples in our Connect group, my wife and I run 2 Connect groups. She has one with ladies, I have one with guys, and then together we actually lead one with married couples with kids. And in that particular group with couples, one of our friends, Lou and Tubbs, who had just received a new baby, given birth to a new baby a couple of months ago, decided it was time to take a break. And so they were heading down to the KZN area and the Eastern Cape area, just on a vacation, taking a break. When they came along the KZN area, or along Pietermaritzburg, they found out that the child, who was a few months old, was sick. It turned out that the child had COVID. Child ended up being admitted to hospital, and the mom, Tabs, ended up staying at hospital with the child for a number of days. Now, this was unplanned, as you can imagine. And you can only imagine when a couple has just received their first child, just given birth to their first child, everything kind of feels a little scary, especially regarding COVID. The amount of people who've lost their lives, the amount of people who didn't make it out of hospital. And here they are in this situation that they hadn't planned for. Lou, the husband, later found out that he himself has COVID. But he wasn't permitted to actually stay in hospital with his wife and his daughter. So he needed a place to stay. But because this was unplanned, he had to travel from Pietermaritzburg into Joburg, get some stuff so he can come back and be with his wife and daughter. But on his way to Joburg, he came across this accident. In fact, this is the exact text that he sent our Connect group, WhatsApp group. He was on his way and he came across this massive accident on the highway. And here's a man whose first child has got COVID and is in hospital for a few days. He's got COVID and he stops in the middle of the road to help. He becomes one of the first responders in the situation, right? You and I can totally understand if he decided that it was okay to drive past this accident because he needed to rush to Joburg so that he might get back to his wife and sick kid, right? We would totally think that it was reasonable, but what would make somebody do that? What would make anyone in the midst of their own crisis stop to help in someone else's crisis? Last week, I shared a sermon titled, Just in Case Things Get Worse. Today, I want to kind of do a part 2 and kind of flip it around a little bit as we continue in the book of Acts. Today's message is, how do you use your worst days for others? Learning how to use your worst days for the sake of others. So today's scripture is going to come from Acts chapter 27. At this point, you're aware that much of the story that Luke is writing is centered not only around the work of the Spirit primarily, but at this point, the main character that Luke is talking about and looking into their life is a guy called Paul. And we take it right up here in Acts chapter 27, verse 13 to 36. Paul is in a ship on its way to Italy, to Rome. Here's what it says. Now, when the south wind blew gently, supposing that they had obtained their purpose, they weighed anchor and sailed along Crete, close to the shore. But soon a tempestuous wind, called the northeaster, struck down from the land. And when the ship was caught and could not face the wind, we gave way to it and were driven along. Running under the lee of a small island called Cudia, we managed with difficulty to secure the ship's boat. After hoisting it up, they used supports to undergird the ship. Then, fearing that they would run aground on Cyprus, they lowered the gear, and thus they were driven along. Since we were violently storm-tossed, they began the next day to jettison the cargo, And on the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days and no small tempest lay on us, all hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. Since they had been without food for a long time, Paul stood up among them and said, "Men, you should have listened to me and not have set sail from Crete and incurred this injury and loss. Yet now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For this very night there stood before me an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I worship. And he said, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar. And behold, God has granted you all those who sail with you. So take heart, men, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told. But we must run aground on some island.' When the 14th night had come, as we were being driven across the Adriatic Sea, about midnight the sailors suspected that they were nearing land. So they took a sounding and found 20 fathoms. A little further on, they took a sounding again and found 15 fathoms. And fearing that we might run on the rocks, they let down 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. And as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship and had lowered the ship's boat into the sea under the pretense of laying out anchors from the bow, Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, 'Unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved.' Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the ship's boat and let it go." Verse 33. As day was about to dawn, Paul urged them all to take some food, saying, "Today is the 14th day that you have continued in suspense and without food, having taken nothing. Therefore I urge you to take some food, for it will give you strength, for not a hair is to perish from the head of any of you." And when he had said these things, he took bread and giving thanks to God in the presence of all, he broke it and began to eat. Then they were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. This is the word of the Lord. Lord, help us today as we hear your word, as we receive your word. Help us to obey your word in Jesus' name. Amen. From Acts 23 to Acts 26, it's nothing short of just the sufferings of Paul. Everything is just going from bad to worse. One bad thing to the next. All that is happening to Paul. He has been on 3 trials before King Agrippa, before Festus, before Felix, and none of those trials were of any fruit for Paul. You can only imagine, not only was he beaten, not only was he wrongfully accused of something that they claimed that he did in Jerusalem and the temple, but he was also battered in his own soul, discouraged. There was fruit. There's a desire that Paul had, not only just to reach the Gentiles, but also that he might have an audience with the Jews and the Jewish leaders, that he might be able to share the gospel, what God has done in his life, and see them turn and see them follow Jesus so that they might know him. None of that has happened. Every time he's come to trial, either he's been punched in the mouth, misunderstood, being spoken down, or whatever it is, but Paul has not been able to gain much fruit. And here he is, now a prisoner in a ship on his way to Rome. Because ultimately, at the end of all those trials, Paul appealed to Caesar. So this is kind of good news for Paul, because Paul had always desired to go to Rome. In fact, in Romans chapter 9, Paul speaks about how he had been longing to actually come to Rome and preach the gospel in Rome, and he's about to get an opportunity to do that. He's not going to go to Rome as a missionary. He's going to go to Rome as a prisoner. He's not going to go to Rome with the provision of his tent-making work that we know that Paul was not just a preacher or a missionary, but he was a tent maker. That's how he also earned a bit of his income. He's not going to go to Rome because of the provision that came from his tent making, nor is he going to go to Rome because some of the churches have provided the means for him to go. He's going to go to Rome on Rome's budget. He's going to be a prisoner in a ship, a cargo ship that's making its way to Italy, from Egypt to Italy. You know, sometimes we desire for God to bring us to certain places. And that desire is fair, that desire is even good, and I dare say that desire is probably noble. But how it happens sometimes is out of our control. How it happens sometimes is not the way we think it would happen. We might think we'll go there as missionaries, but we might end up going there as prisoners. We might think the provision will come from one place, but the provision might completely come from a whole nother different place because we are stuck somewhere in the middle of a place that we didn't think we would ever be in. This is Paul's story. Every single chapter from Acts chapter 20 just seems to be going downhill, but Paul is on his way to Rome. And so sure enough, they're on the ship on their way to Rome, and a northeaster, basically a hurricane comes. And the hurricane begins to just spiral this ship out of control. They don't know what to do. They're stressed out. They have no idea how to handle this. And it's in this moment that we realize that the one in Acts chapter 23, verse 11, we spoke about last week, Paul, who seemed discouraged and in prison and needed encouragement. In this story, he's going to be the one who gives the encouragement. The one who needed comfort a few chapters ago, where the Lord himself appeared in his prison and told him, take courage, Paul, you're going to go to Rome, right? That individual becomes the one who's going to distribute comfort to those who seem in need, those who seem discouraged, those who feel like all is lost right here in the shipwreck. They are all staring down the end of their lives and wondering how it's all going to work out. And it's Paul who becomes the one who encourages them. In fact, Paul speaks about this idea in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 4 to 6. And that's what today's word is going to be all about. That we who've been comforted, we who've been encouraged, we who have gone through our worst days are now called to use our worst days for the sake of others. Check what it says, 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 4 to 6. He, speaking of God, comforts us in all our troubles so that we can comfort others, right? So when God comforts us in our troubles, in our problems, in our pain, discouragement, in our hurt, in our brokenness, it is for a purpose, that we would be able to comfort others. When they are troubled, we will be able to give them the same comfort God has given us. For the more we suffer for Christ, the more God will shower us with his comfort through Christ. Even when we are weighed down with troubles, it is for your comfort and salvation. For when we ourselves are comforted, we will certainly comfort you. Here's the deal, is that we, as the people of God, don't just have the privilege of God comforting us in our agony, pain, loss, grief, and brokenness. We have the invitation to go into the world and allow our worst days, the comfort that God gave us on our worst days to now be a comfort for the sake of others. Let's break down the story and see how we can do this, how God allows us to do this, how God empowers us to be these kind of people. So Acts chapter 27, verse 17 to 20, it tells us that after they had been hosting it up, they used the supports to undergird the ship. And then it says this, then fearing that they would run aground on the Syrtis. Now, it was understood in those days that this area that they were fearing that the boat was moving towards was known as the area where boats go to die. They kind of knew if the boat moves aground to this area, it's not going to make it. And they were doing everything in their power to try and avoid the boat from getting there, to avoid the ship, rather, from getting there. So here's what they did. They lowered the gear, and thus they were driven along. And then further than that, verse 18 tells us that since we were violently storm-tossed, they began the next day to jettison the cargo. Now, this ship was moving most likely from Egypt to about Italy, and the purpose of the ship was to deliver cargo. There weren't any luxury ships in those days, or kind of what we might call maybe police ships that might take people from one place to the next. Kind of like Tabo Bester style, had to hire a private jet to go get the guy. And so here is what was happening, is that this cargo ship was en route, and so the centurion, his name is Julius, we know about this in the greater chapter of chapter 27. The centurion Julius was tasked to take Paul to Rome. And so he came on the boat with a number of soldiers, but also came onto the boat with a number of prisoners as well. Paul was privileged enough to be allowed to bring in 2 companions, one of which was actually Luke, who wrote the book of Acts, right? So there's prisoners, there's Paul with his 2 companions, there's soldiers. Also, there is the Roman governor, Roman centurion rather, named Julius. In total, there were about 276 people on this ship making their way. The purpose, though, of this ship was to deliver grain and wheat. So not only were the soldiers prisoners and Paul and his companions there, but there were also sailors who actually had come all the way from Egypt with the purpose of making sure that this cargo reaches its target. They were all in this boat. 276 men were in the ship making their way. But they knew the only way they can try and avoid this ship from getting to this dangerous place is to start throwing out cargo. They began to jettison the cargo. They began to throw out things, different furnitures inside the ship to try and avoid it from moving in a particular direction. And on the 3rd day, bear in mind, they've been struggling to sleep. 3 days they've been at it. On the 3rd day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with its own hands. And when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, no small tempest lay on them. Right? They can't see the sun. They can't see the stars. This has been going on now for way more days than what they anticipated, and tells us that they lost all hope. Right? See, what do we do when we encounter friends, family, maybe even foes who are wrestling with fear? Maybe they're wrestling, in this particular case, with the kind of fear whereby they are trying their utmost best to avoid something. Yeah, I had those situations when you know people, or maybe you were that person. You were so afraid of the worst outcome that you did everything in your power to try and avoid it. You couldn't sleep, you couldn't think, you just were trying to avoid. Like kind of these people, all they were doing is they were just throwing things outside the ship. They were just doing whatever they can because they believed that they were at the end. And so they were just throwing all that they can find out of the ship to try and avoid shipwreck. But here, Acts 27, verse 21 to 26, look at Paul's response. This we can learn as to how you and I can comfort those who in fear feel like it's all coming to an end, who feel like, man, I need to avoid something, I need to stop something or avoid something or this situation right here, this is it. Here's what it says, verse 21 to 26. Since they had been without food for a long time, Paul stood up among them and said to them, men, you should have listened to me. Now, prior to this, Paul had actually spoken to the centurion and told him, you shouldn't sail from Crete and you should rather wait because of the season and the possible weather issues we might incur. But they didn't listen to Paul. And the reason why they didn't listen to Paul is that at the time, when Paul was having this conversation with the centurion, they were in a kind of like a small little city, a small little town. And to be honest, it was quite a boring town. And so you can imagine you got 276 men on this boat, on the ship. And what they want to do, they want to sail to a city that's much bigger, much larger, more entertainment. Because oftentimes what used to happen for sailors going from city to city, they would stop at cities that were big enough for them to come in and be entertained. And some of that entertainment might include prostitutes in the nearby city. And so the centurion listened to the crowd, didn't listen to Paul. So as they sailed, they came across this hurricane, and now they're in crisis. So here's what Paul continues to say in verse 22. Yet now I urge you to take heart. In other words, I'm not trying to one-up you and say, hey, I was right, you were wrong. But I'm saying this so that you might listen to what I'm going to say next. Take heart, take courage. Why? For there will be no loss of life among you. Only the boat will be wrecked. No one else is going to die. Just the boat will be wrecked. Why? Because this very night there stood before me an angel of God whom I belong to and whom I serve. And he said to me, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar. You see, one of the reasons that these guys are going to make it is because of God's purpose over Paul's life. Paul must still make it all the way to Rome and stand before Caesar. But also, the Lord tells him through this angel that he's given him everybody in this boat. Everybody will be safe. No one will die. So take heart, man. Verse 25. For I have faith in God that he will be exactly as he has told me. That things will be exactly as he has told me. Right? So this is what Paul's saying. When we find friends, foes, family in a place of fear, when they feel like it's all coming to an end, when they feel like they need to avoid something, what do? We give them an eternal perspective. See, this is why we have to be men and women of the word, men and women of worship, men and women of prayer, men and women who know our identity in Christ. Right? Because right here in this moment, what we learn from Paul is that when others feel like the end is near, we can bring comfort to them. We can encourage them by giving them eternal perspective. Why are we able to do this? It was quite simple. Because we know that this is not the end. That's why. We know that no matter how tough life is, no matter how crazy everything is, no matter how many times things don't make sense, and even in the midst of a world that continuously reminds us how broken it is, we know that this world is and will never be the end. A number of years ago, I don't know if you guys remember this, when a TV show 24 came out, my boy Jack Bauer. There's nothing Jack Bauer couldn't do, right? And I think it had 7 or 8 seasons, right? By the 8th season, you were kind of like, okay, guys, you should have stopped like a season ago. But I'd watch all the season with my wife. And I would recommend the show to so many friends of mine, like, oh, you have to watch 24. You have to watch 24. And so when they would start season 1, they were so caught up in it. They loved it, but they were constantly anxious because Jack Bauer was constantly getting himself in trouble. You constantly thought Jack Bauer was going to die. And I had to remind them, don't worry, like there's 7 more seasons that are coming. 7 more seasons. You see, sometimes the way we are called to serve people who believe that this is the end is to remind them that this is just the end of a moment. It's not the end of the world. Why? Because we know what the end of the world will look like. That the end of the world looks like Jesus coming back for his bride. And until then, all we are experiencing, though painful, though discouraging, though sometimes leaving us with a lot of pain and a lot of heartache, is the end of a moment. It's not the end of the world. Because the way the end of the world will look like is not only that Jesus will come and take his people and judge the world finally, but also, here's what it says in Revelation 21, verse 4 to 5. He, Jesus, will wipe every tear from our eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain. For the old order of things has passed away, right? Right now, you and I are living in what will be called the old order of things. And then verse 5, I love this. He says, he who was seated on the throne said, I am making everything new. There is no situation in this life that will be the end. Because we know there's always another season. We know that the end is only when Jesus comes to take his people. I was thinking about this idea this week. I was reminded of a very famous verse that Paul wrote, Romans 8, verse 28, that essentially Paul says, all things work for the good. All things work for the good of those who love God, right? What he doesn't say is that all things are good, but instead that all things work for the good. And it actually reminded me of Genesis, that one of the reasons we as believers are confident in God's ability to work all things out for the good is simply this. You see, anyone can take a good thing and continue to make it good. Anyone and everyone can take a good thing and make it bad. But God, since the beginning of time that we understand, God was able to take chaos and make it ordered. He was able to take that which was void and give it life. He was able to take that which was broken, chaotic, seemingly without the beauty that it later had, and turn it around and make it beautiful. Turn it into a garden. We serve a God who from the beginning of time takes the chaotic things of this world and makes them good. If God can do that in creation, why can't he do that with your life? See, here's the reality. No matter how many times we feel like we are near the end, there's still another season. And ours, those of us who've been comforted by God, in our moments of feeling like we're near the end of self, we are near the end of our lives, and yet God's comfort has come to us. God has opened up his life and his word to us. We are now called to give an eternal perspective to those who find themselves in a temporal situation. Why? Because we know that this is not the end. Furthermore, not only that, Paul continues to help the people in the ship. Acts chapter 27, verse 27 to 30 says this: when the 14th night had come, as we were being driven across the Adriatic Sea, about midnight, the sailors suspected that they were nearing land. They possibly were hearing rocks and all kinds of things hitting the ship. And they took a sounding and found 20 fathoms. So basically what this looked like is like a rope that had an anchor underneath, and that you would throw it into the sea, and you would lift up the rope so that you can tell how much water was underneath your boat, so that you can see how far from shore you probably were, because they could hear all these rocks hitting against the ship. And a little further on, they took a sounding again and found 15 fathoms. So they moved from 20 fathoms to now 15 fathoms. They, in their minds, are beginning to realize, oh my word, we're nearing some kind of shore, or we are nearing some kind of collision with some rocks. And so here's what it says in verse 29. And fearing that we might run on the rocks, they let down 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for the day to come. And as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship and had lowered the ship's boat into the sea under the pretense of laying out the anchors from the bow, Paul said to the centurion and to the soldiers. Now let me pause there. So here's what's happening. The people who have the responsibility of taking the cargo from Egypt to Italy, the sailors, have come to realize that this boat is going to crash, right? This boat is going to hit a whole bunch of rocks. So what do? They speak amongst themselves, and they privately act as though they're letting down anchors, but actually outside the anchors that they had let down, they're now letting down a small boat from the ship so that they might get into the boat and escape, leave everybody else in there, right? But it's interesting, the sailors are trying to escape from something. Sometimes our fear, sometimes our dread leads us to want to escape from something, to get ourselves out of a situation, out of a work situation, out of a relationship, out of a study situation, out of a financial situation. Why? Because we are afraid that a crash is coming. We fear that there's nothing we can do to stop this. But watch what Paul says, how Paul responds. I like this, my favorite part in this whole text. Paul said to the centurion and to the soldiers, right? Because they're the highest rank out of everybody who's in that ship. He says, unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. Then the moment they heard this, the soldiers, not the sailors, the soldiers cut away the ropes from the ship's boat and let it go. Sometimes you need friends in your life who, when you want to escape from responsibility, they cut the ropes. That they don't allow you to run away from that which you're called to do. That they don't allow you to escape, to rescue yourself from the purposes of God for your life. These soldiers cut the ropes so that the sailors might stay in the ship. Before I continue here, isn't it interesting here for a moment? Didn't God already say in the first few verses that they're going to make it? Everybody is going to be alive. So why is now Paul saying in this verse that unless these men, these sailors, stay in the ship, you cannot be saved? Isn't God all-knowing and all-powerful? So why do they need to stay in the boat for everybody to be saved? See, this is that interesting theological tension of being predestined and man having responsibility. We find this clash right here. And actually, it's spoken of as though it's not a clash. That God is actually able to be all-knowing, and God is able to predestine without him causing. So God's knowledge of something does not equate to God's causation of something. That actually our free will is not removed in God's ability to predestine the outcome, in God's ability to know how it will all end. Our will stays intact. You see, here's what Paul knows, is that as much as God is fully sovereign, we are also fully responsible. It's not like 100% God and 50% us. It's not like 50% God and 50% us. It's 100% God's sovereignty, 100% man's responsibility. And by the way, this is good for your soul. Because if you think it's 100% our responsibility, you will always be panicked. You will always be stressed. You will always be afraid. Because if it all just hangs on what you do, then there is so much strain and stress that comes to our lives because we are the determiner of our destiny. But in the same vein, if it's 100% on God, we become passive. We don't become panicked. We just become passive. So what? It doesn't matter. There's no need to pray. There's no need to stay on we just become passive. But that's not what we learn from this story. It's not an either or. It's a both and, that our choices do matter. And yet at the same time, God is sovereign. That God has a plan, and yet at the same time, we have free will. And so, this is helpful as we think of life in reality of pain and suffering. As we think of life in the reality of purpose and also the eternal. That we have a responsibility, but God has a plan. And when we don't understand, we trust God's plans. And when God reveals himself, we respond with our responsibility. When we know what we ought to do, we do it. When we don't know what we ought to do, we trust. We live in the both and. It doesn't have to be either or. But watch this, how Paul responds in a manner that actually gives encouragement and comfort to the men in this boat. Here they are, they're afraid and they want to escape, but Paul's response is he doesn't give eternal perspective this time. What does he do? He gives practical instruction, practical wisdom. Sometimes the best comfort we can give our friends, family, or foes is practical instruction. When people feel like if they've come to the end of their knowledge, come to the end of themselves, they don't know what else to do. We are able to give them practical instruction. You know why? Because we know that God is with us. Let me tell you why this makes sense. The Bible tells us this in Isaiah chapter 24, 5 and 19. It says, "The earth suffers for the sins of its people, for they have twisted God's instructions, violated his laws, and broken his everlasting covenant. The earth has broken up. It has utterly collapsed. It is violently shaken." That's verse 19. Then it says this. Listen carefully to Isaiah chapter 43, verse 2. It says, "When you go through deep waters, I will be with you. When you go through rivers of difficulty, I will not let you drown, or you will not drown. When you walk through the fire of oppression, you will not be burnt up, the flames will not consume you. You see, sometimes the reason why people fail to act in moments of crisis is because they believe there's no hope. But we know that crisis or not, God is with us. This means that we are so aware that when people reach the end of their ability, it does not mean that God has reached the end of his ability. And so our comfort of practical wisdom to those in need is us reaching into God's arsenal of wisdom, of instruction, that we can support people with when they feel like they have come to the end of themselves. God is with us. It means to us that no matter what kind of crisis we're in, God knows. God knows not only what we should do, he knows what we shouldn't do. God understands exactly the moment we're in. God knows exactly the moment we're in, and he can help us in the moment. And so we reach to his wisdom, which is always higher than our wisdom. Lastly, Acts chapter 27, verse 33 says this: as day was about to dawn, Paul urged them all to take some food. So this is interesting. The people have not eaten for 14 days. So here's what he says: today is the 14th day that you have continued in suspense without food, having taken nothing. So there's two ideas here as to why they haven't eaten. One, most likely that they might have tried to be preserving food because they didn't know how long they were going to be out on sea for. But also another option is this: have you ever been so anxious, so tired, so busy, so afraid that you just kept on going and just forgot to eat? You just kept on eating little bits along the day, and you were just feeling so depleted, so exhausted because you were caught up in fear. They couldn't even notice whether it was day or night for days. They were just trying to stay alive. You see, sometimes fear causes us to preserve some things, thinking that, oh man, we might not make it, so let's preserve the little we have so we can have some later. Or sometimes fear causes us to forget to do the simple things. Regardless of that reality, here's the reality. These guys were hungry, had not eaten for 14 days, and Paul literally pleads with them to eat. So watch his response to their fear. Acts chapter 27, 34 to 36. Therefore, I urge you to take some food, for it will give you strength, for not a hair is to perish from the head of you. And when he had said these things, he took bread, gave thanks to God. In the presence of all, he broke it and began to eat. And then they all were encouraged and ate some food themselves. Paul responds by giving them what? He gives them presents. So hear me out. There's sometimes when, with our friends, families, and foes, the comfort we can give them is an eternal perspective, right? Sometimes the comfort we can give our friends, family, and foes is practical wisdom for life. But there are times when the best thing we can give our friends, family, and foes is just to be there, just to be with them, just to give them presence. So what does presence look like? It looks like not being on your phone. It looks like being there and them sensing that you're there, instead of them feeling like you're there in body, but your mind is somewhere else. But you are actually present with them. in body and in mind and in heart, you're present with them. Why are we able to do this? Even when we are going through our own stuff. Why are we able, who are suffering and going through who are feeling the pain, feeling the agony, how are we able to be presently present for other people when they are going through their crisis? They are panicking, trying to preserve things, just completely forgetting to eat, and yet we are right there in their grief and in their pain. How? Simple. It's because we know that God understands. See, we are aware that God gets it. God gets us. God gets them. God can empathize with the situation they're in. Well, we don't need to know more things. We don't need to say more things. We don't need to do more things. But our presence is an outward demonstration that God understands. God is fully empathizing with them in their moment. And this is best described in the book of Hebrews, chapter 4, verse 14 to 16. I want to read this one particularly from the Message version. I love the way they put it here. Here's what it says. It says, now that we know we have Jesus, this great high priest with ready access to God, let's not let it slip through our fingers. We don't have a priest who is out of touch with our reality. He's been through weakness and testing, experienced it all but the sin. So let's walk right up to him and get what he is ready to give. Take the mercy and accept the help. I love that version. See, God is a kind of high priest. Jesus is a kind of high priest who can completely empathize with us. He gets it. He understands. So when we as believers physically are present in the chaos of our friend's life, it is for us an ability that comes because we are fully aware that God, not us, not anyone else, but God perfectly understands the situation. We don't need to come with perfect wisdom, and we don't need to come with perfect knowledge, but our presence itself speaks. It speaks of love. It speaks of care. It speaks of God's understanding and God's patience, God's presence with them. So what have I said today? I've said that we have an invitation to not only be privileged enough to be comforted by God in our chaos, but we have an invitation to now comfort others in theirs. That our worst days now actually become a means for us to comfort other people. Our worst days are never wasted. They now become a means of comfort for those who find themselves in pain, those who find themselves in hurt. In fact, Paul, in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, 25 to 28, watch what he says and see if you see any similarities to why he was able to do what he did right here in the midst of this shipwreck. Here's what he says in verse 25 to 28. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was pelted with stones. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent a night and a day in the open sea. I have been constantly on the move. I have been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger from my fellow Jews, in danger from Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, in danger at sea, in danger from false believers. I have labored and toiled, and I have often gone without sleep. I have known hunger and thirst, and have often gone without food. I have been cold and naked. Besides everything else, I face daily the pressure of my concern for all the churches. Paul knew what it was like to be comforted in the midst of dangers and being deserted and pain and beatings and shipwrecks and anxiety and labor and hunger and sleeplessness. Now Paul was able to comfort others in this moment. When I started the sermon, I started off with a story with this picture from my friend Lutando in our Connect group. And I told you that he stopped on the side of the road to help strangers in this car crash. And I left you with a question. Well, what kind of people do this? What kind of people are able to stop in the middle of the road for people they don't know when they themselves are in crisis, when his own child is in hospital, few months old with COVID, he's leaving his wife with her, and he's making his way. What makes him stop? Here's a story I didn't tell you. I'll never forget this day. I was at Rosebank Mall walking out of one of the restaurants, and I received a message from his wife from Tubbs. It was a number of years ago, a couple of years ago actually. At that time, she was still his fiance at the time. And the message came in, and the message said that Lutando had just lost his sister. See, Lou knows what it's like to lose a loved one. He knows what it's like to lose someone that you feel like you lost this person before their time. See, what makes people stop, pull over, is that they remember that they were comforted in their loss, in their pain. So, as you consider your life and how God has proven himself faithful, merciful, gracious in your life, ours is to pass it forward. Ours is to pass it on. Ours is to intentionally be found in the lives of our friends, family, and foes who are in hurt, who are in pain, who are feeling like they've come to the end of themselves, the end of their solution, who are feeling like they are in a situation whereby they need to give up, need to give in. And we need to rock up in those situations with eternal perspective, because we know that this is not the end. We need to rock up in those situations with practical wisdom at times, because we know that God is with us. And we need to rock up at times with present presence, because we know that God understands. No matter where you're watching this from and what you're going through, I pray that if you need comforting, that you would experience his presence. I pray that you would have the kind of friends who can be this for you. But even if you don't, there is a God who can comfort you right now, in your moment, in your pain. And when it's all said and done, he will invite you and call you to do the same for others. Hey family, I hope that word encouraged you. Thank you again for tuning in. And a reminder, those of you who are new here, do click on our connection card under this video. And by the way, what we do believe here is that no one can follow Christ alone, that you actually need to be in fellowship with other people. And for that, we've got close to about 50 connect groups meeting at different times around the city. In fact, we're even looking to start new connect groups. We just don't have enough groups right now for everybody. And so if you want to sign up to be in a group, sign up today. We want to try and help you get in a group as soon as possible. But some of you might be watching this and you're already in a group and you would like to start a group. We want to help you do that, but also we want to encourage you to consider and prayerfully consider lifting up your hand and doing that, starting a group in your area, in whatever format, whether it's hybrid or in person or online. So please let us know by signing on the links below. Also, I want to highly encourage you. Maybe you were listening to this sermon, watching this video and going, man, I need to get a bit more serious my relationship with God. Maybe you are not saved, you've never crossed the line of faith, or you don't know Christ, or you stepped away from Christ, and you're saying, man, I want to follow him. Sign up for our Pathways class today. Or maybe you've been saved for a while, but you felt like you've lost touch with the core tenets of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. Pathways class is for you as well. So sign up for Pathways. It happens every Sunday online, 2 p.m. over the Zoom platform. It will help you towards two things: knowing God and making him known. So sign up today for our Pathways class. Now, as we do every Sunday, we want to send you off with a blessing. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord cause his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon you, and may he give you shalom, peace, fill you with his spirit, give you courage. See you next week.
Holy Spirit, draw